So, Steve Cobb, thanks for coming. Much appreciated.
Yes, great to be here.
So, listen, I'm glad to meet you in person. You know, we did this virtual.
This is fun for sure.
You know, always amazed me like how you know, people as much as we like doing these virtual stuff. It's much better to do this in person. There's something to be said about being in the same room. So you came here because you're a practitioner, right? You came here to learn. You know, Black Hat has been almost a staple for a lot of practitioners for many years. You know, specifically, what kind of skill set are you looking to gain from this event?
So I've been coming to Black Hat for a few years now and doing the training. The training's, you know, fantastic, by the way. So out here learning and expanding my skill set. A lot of it's got to do just with some leadership aspects as well as new techniques around defending. You know, I think you're seeing a little bit of an addition to the Black Hat DEF CON world where they're taking maybe defenders into the fold a little bit more than they used to. It was all about, you know, up until 2 or 3 years ago, honestly, it was all about attack, offensive. How do we hack? How do we break and those sorts of things. You're seeing a more openness to taking that knowledge and helping companies use it to defend themselves, right? And so that blue team, a little bit of purple team type of idea coming more and more. And that's really what I'm here to try to learn as much as possible, because for all the, cool hacks that you can do and all the neat stuff that you can do to break into places and own them and pwn them and all those sorts of things, that's great. But when it comes down, realistic, what pays the bills, our company's there to try to protect and defend companies, and we want to do it the best way we know how.
Yeah, and it's, it gets one to know one, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's so you got to try to get into mindset. Which leads me to the next question. We've seen a lot of things change, and during the pandemic, and then afterwards, and now it seems like we're one thing after another. Now we're getting hit by economic conditions that are less than ideal.
Right.
Do you see, security getting impacted, like from your customers? Are they investing less, or they're worried more? What's your take? Because you have kind of the hand, like the pulse of the market.
Yeah, I think we are seeing customers that are they're being more budget conscious with the decisions they're making, right? So they're making decisions around the boardroom. The C-suites are having discussions on what is it we're doing today that really is providing the most value in our security operations, security controls. And that's where I think for us, selfishly as a security partner, where we come in to provide some value to customers where maybe they don't have to spend on headcount or tooling, we can provide that as part of it. Now, I'll also say though, I think there are customers that are looking to trim those places where they used to have security tools or other things. We see it all the time when we come in environments where organizations will have spent good money on really good tools, but maybe they never implemented them correctly, or they have nobody's watching the video screen of detections coming in and that sort of thing. And I think they are being a little more intentional about the money they spend and how they spend it.
And so you're well positioned though, because you are helping customers take advantage of, first of all, the existing infrastructure and tools that they already have in place. Right. And then offset some of that cost associated with running these tools by offloading it to you, right? We just talk, in the hallway over here, where you take a certain steps to when you take ownership over a new infrastructure and customers. Talk to me about that process, because it was really super interesting.
Yeah, well, we learned early on when we had to experience it a little bit that we wanted to make sure that environments or customers that we bring on, that we're validating the environment that we're inheriting, right? So a lot of times, as I mentioned, they may have really good tools that may not have been configured correctly. They may have been put on the shelf and not even turned on. We've seen that in places. And we've seen...
Well, that's where the shelfware comes on.
Yeah, exactly. Vaporware, shelfware, that's right. And we see that a lot. But we want to make sure that as we come into those environments, we have a good understanding of the controls they have in place, or what's already there, and what risks may have already been potentially exploited by an attacker. So we will typically come in and we bring a customer on board and put them through a onboarding process that maybe has items in it that most managed security providers may not do. One of those being, we put honeypots in the environment to see if there's an attacker there already, and maybe we can entice them to show themselves so we can take it, we can take appropriate steps. And more times than not, that may be a little bit high, but many, many times we come in environments where we put sensors in place or we put honeypots in place to discover there's an attacker or a threat already in the environment. And the customer had no idea. A lot of times we'll find artifacts where data's been exfiltrated, or we've even come into a place where we've mentioned to the customer, hey, we found this data that's been moved around pretty interestingly, and the customer would say, oh, you know what? We had a competitor who somehow started to gain market share from us based on some of the IP or intellectual property we had, and discovering things that maybe had a data leak.
That's incredible.
Yeah, maybe you had a data leak or you did have a data leak that maybe you didn't even know about, right? So that's places where we want to come in because, as we talked about in the hallway, as soon as that customer comes on board with us, we own it, right? We've inherited that, and that's where we want to be. We want to own that, but we'd also want to make sure that we are alerting the customer to the situation before they can point the finger at us and say, hey, you all let these folks in. We come back in that first week before we even onboard and kind of give that report of, hey, there's some things we already see in your environment that are suspicious, or have you had activity or breaches in the past? And sure enough, those things come to light.
Is it almost like too much? Because there's signing,
too much.
No, but you're the signing up with you, and some of these folks are not. They're not. Security is not in their DNA,
sure.
Right? So it's just now they finally said, okay, let's get on board, and then the first engagement that you have with you, this comes up,
right? Yeah.
And you are as a CISO has to deliver the bad news.
Yeah.
What's that like?
It's usually not fun. I mean, I do think that for customers, as we try to change their customer culture and behavior to be more security conscious and security aware, there is some, I think, thankfulness from the customer side to say, hey, sure it's bad, but at least we know it, right? And we know what's out there. And I think there's an understanding with the customer that they have to make this move. It's almost, you're dipping out into the water, you don't know how to swim for the first time. To know you've got those floaties on your arms, right, makes you feel a little bit better. And that's really, I think, the sense that a lot of folks have of, yes, there's some bad things going on, but we're here to help you and come in and try to take the necessary steps so we can at least stop what's going on now and protect them from the future.
And are these the usual suspects, or are these the reaction is why us? Sometimes these customers are, they always say okay, we're not a target, right? Because they're and
small. They've been in business forever. They're mom and pop. They don't think what they sell or what they have is worth anybody going after. Oh yeah, hear all those stories. For sure.
Yeah. So when you come back and see, and then you mentioned that even the IP theft, it's incredible. I think it shows you we're a knowledge-based economy. Anything to do with how I don't care if you're a brick and mortar, or a restaurant, whatever the case. The money is in your process,
yep,
something
exactly
you engineered over a period of 20 years, especially if you were engineering, your manufacturing process and so on. That's valuable, and that's what is getting stolen. Right?
Yeah, and I think that's the piece that a lot of companies undervalue. Honestly, they may not have maybe the strategy or the business acumen, if you will, to think about their impact on the industry or where they're at. From that standpoint, they just make widgets, and they've been making widgets, and they're great at making widgets, and that's what they've always done. And to your point, I think a lot of people undervalue that the secret sauce that they use to make those widgets. Even if there's 10 other companies making those widgets, a lot of times is their brand, it's their reputation, it's who they are. And so that information getting out or that information being leaked has real consequences to that company's reputation and their opportunity to make more revenue and more profit going forward. So those are things that we want to try to protect as much as possible. And in today's world where ransomware is a more and more prevalent thing, attackers now are not just pivoting, or they are pivoting from just encrypting, making it difficult for you to get on your laptop or get your data. They're pivoting to that extortion front where, hey, I've got your data, and now if you want it back, you got to pay for it.
Yeah, and it's incredible. Again, that no one is safe. Like in the sense that and I'm sure it was quite a shock to their system to view something like that, especially when they finally realized that they need security. So you kind of went through and evaluated like the kind of the status quo. How do you then decide where to prioritize? Like, because it's, again, you're coming into an infrastructure maybe that is legacy or have some application that no one attached, and maybe you have an IT guy or gal that were doing something else for 10 years.
Right, and now they're doing security. Maybe.
Yeah,
Yep.
So that's a lot to handle. It's almost like getting a stray dog off the pound and trying to get them to a point where they're a show dog.
Right.
What's that process look like?
Yeah, that process is usually pretty painful, to be quite honest, because it is an environment where customers haven't thought about the security apparatus, the security details that they need to take in their environments, and leading them down that path is sometimes it's painful. Now, the good thing is if they can wrap their heads around the idea that security should be an enabler to my business rather than a hurdle or a hit to the bottom line, then we can get over that hump of prioritizing. These are the things you need to take. You need to take the steps you need to take soon because they pose the most risk. So it's a risk-based discussion about where are you exposed the greatest, and then addressing those one-off. And that is the challenge, I think, is you dump potentially a lot of information on a new CIO, not new CIO, but for the first time a CIO. This may be new information for him or her to see. It's a lot to really digest, right? And so that's where we come in, or other managed security providers come in, where we can take that information and say, hey, here's 40 pages of stuff that you need to think about, but let's focus on the first 2 pages and take bites out of this as we go, and we can reduce the risk. I think, too, Dave, that's one of the things that a lot of customers or a lot of organizations that I speak to are really scared to take that first step. It's really scary to take that first step because you don't know what you don't know. But if we can get them to that first step and say, yes, it's painful, but we can help you get through the initial piece, we can reduce risk tremendously just by doing some pretty straightforward and easy, simple steps. You just have to be willing to take the steps with us.
And how do you get the buy-in from everybody? Because I'm assuming that there's a champion that called you in that loves you or about to love you.
Right.
And what's not to love? But then then you come over and you dump them the 40-page report, and then we'll have to reorg or re-engineer, some basic stuff. But how do you then get the buy-in from the rest of the company to really get the stuff done?
Well, sometimes it's showing them what potentially the consequences are. I never like to work in that FUD state, the fear, uncertainty, doubt. I don't like to work in that space, but quite honestly, sometimes
it works.
You have to go there. And so a lot of times discussions around the board room or with C-suite folks in these organizations really are horror tales. We call them tales from the vault because our SOC is in a vault. It's actually in a bank vault. One of our SOCs is, and so
it's in North Carolina.
Yeah, in Raleigh, North Carolina. Yeah, and so sometimes it's telling them real world stories about the consequences of not taking these steps. Organizations that are like size or maybe have in the industry to them, and what happened to those organizations when they suffered some type of attack.
And statistics are horrible.
Yeah,
if
correct.
you look at the number of years you stay in business after a major breach is not great. If you look at the numbers.
That's exactly right.
So you show them that, and then what's the typical reaction? Are they like, again, sometimes it's too much to absorb, and they block. I guess it's just turned into a like a ostrich, I guess. And
stick their head in the sand. And that I think there is that initial reaction of they kind of get the glassed over eyes, or either they do stick their head in the sand and say, I'm not sure we want to take this on. And that's where the kind of the pushback comes a lot of times, honestly, is that, hey, we've been in business for 18 years, we've never been attacked, or we're having to do this. A lot of these conversations now are coming out of cybersecurity insurance, because some of the insurance providers, or not some of them, all of them are requiring you to do some basic hygiene steps now, right? And so some of these engagements now are coming out of from customers or potential customers who say, hey, we can't get our premiums, or our premiums are 100% higher because we don't have multi-factor authentication in place, or these other things that we really need to put in place. And when you tell them these are the steps and this is what the cost, what your budget's going to look like, you get pushback there a lot. We never had to do this. We should be able to check a box and get over this and that sort of thing. And so, I think that the initial reaction is really helping them understand what the risk is and what potentially the consequences of those risks could be if they don't address them as part of their security program.
So interesting that you mentioned the cyber insurance, because I've seen that quite a bit, because they're in business to be in business. They're not they're not philanthropical, like, oh, let's pay you for your inaccuracies. And so when they come back, I'm assuming that all they want to do is they want you to fix it so they can get the cyber insurance, right?
Yes.
Policy.
A lot of times.
So, and they're thinking, I guess what you just mentioned, they're thinking it's going to be just something they need to do, like, hey, can you help me just do the check mark? And then you come back and say, no, it's you have to go through this step.
That's right.
So
That's right.
What's the engagement look like then? Like, do they realize that they have no choice? It's like they have to do something?
Yeah, I think so. I think that insurance piece in a lot of discussions is a little bit of the hit over the head for a lot of corporations, unfortunately, to understand that they're not going to be able to get the cybersecurity insurance until they meet these criteria or go through these steps.
I'm curious, like, how much leeway do they have? Like, let's say, because I'm assuming they send them, the policy renewal in 4 or 5 months in advance? Like,
yes.
Because that's not a lot of time.
It's not. Especially for some of these controls or remediations that you have to put in place. And depending on the size of the organization, 4 to 5 months may not be enough time. So a lot of it with certain insurance providers, for us, we work with them to say we're basically representing this organization and we're going to take these steps for them on their behalf. And so then we're beholden to come up with a plan, a timeline, and those sort of things to work through. But yeah, that is a lot of times their renewals come up and they've seen their premiums go up 100%, and they're on the flip side, they may say, we just want this to go away, right? We need insurance, but I just need to be able to pay the same thing I have been paying. Now, we've been, across the board, we've typically been seeing premiums go up 10 or 15%, but you have those providers who maybe have not done a health check or discussion with a company there that they are insuring, that will say, we've seen two different scenarios. You either do these steps or we won't insure you at all, or you do these steps or you do these steps or else you're going to pay 100% premium. It's going to double what you paid last year.
Yeah, and that's I think due to the fact that there's so many incidents where companies were insured and then the payout was insane.
Yep. Exactly. And there was a lot of folks, a lot of organizations that were using cybersecurity insurance as their incident plan, right? And that's just not what it's there for.
See, I like it when you call a spade a spade.
I mean,
and you're gonna get some haters, but you just call it like it is.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, don't get me wrong, cybersecurity insurance should be part of your overall plan, but it can't be your only plan, right? I mean, that's asking for trouble. And what happens is you see exactly the market react to it as they are. Cyber insurance providers are saying, hey, we're not just going to fork this money out just for you to continue to do business as you have been doing. There's some steps we know that will lower your risk. They're good for you. They're good for us. You're going to have to do them. So I understand why the cyber insurance market's going this way. I think the problem is for a lot of who gets hurt the most, I think, is that small, medium business owner who has to make these changes, and it's difficult for them to make the changes.
It's almost always the case. I think, like, there's a large enterprise. They have the tools, they have the funds, and they have the teams, frankly. But a lot of it is not, it's almost basic hygiene, right?
It is.
As you mentioned, MFA, I'm assuming some EDR, I'm assuming some, some pen testing or some,
right.
It's not... it's not from a security perspective, security maturity model. They don't expect them to go all the way to the other end, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So it's relatively speaking, they should have it anyway.
Yeah, it is common sense steps, what I would say. It's steps that are very, what we would say, low-hanging fruit, steps that you can take that aren't extremely expensive or labor intensive, but they drastically reduce your risk. And so,
and does the cyber insurance company, do they care, what's the underlying technology, or they just do they ask you for a specific brand? Or
they will. Most all the questionnaires that I've filled out for customers or been involved with, they do ask you for brands. I don't think they really care about the vendor or the brand as much as they want to know that you actually know what you're talking about, right? If they say what MFA provider you're using and you put down Forward, then they probably say, well, there's probably more we need to talk about here, right? So I think that's really why they do it. They do ask those questions, but it really is more about do you have those pieces in place, or do you have a plan to put them in place? And from what I've seen for a lot of insurance providers is as long as you're saying we've got a plan and we're working toward this, they'll take that into consideration.
Yeah, again, because they want to keep you as a customer. Well, the majority of them are not.
Right.
They're not there, and that's what I think that you have to understand is that it's not about the they're not there to butt heads with you. You're a customer eventually.
Right.
They just don't want to lose money. They're not in business to lose money.
Right.
So it's super interesting. So. Aside from that, what other project are you involved in on a regular basis? So you mentioned that those are like the onboarding, which is really cool, by the way, to put in a honeypot in place.
Yeah.
Which you mentioned specifically, not a lot of service providers are doing it, right?
Yeah. I mean, when we look around the industry, that's not something that a lot of them think about. And so we do it, as I said, for our own protection, but also for the client's protection, just so we know what we're going into. Because if the intruder or threat actor is already in the environment, doesn't do a lot of good for us to put barriers up on the outside when they're already in the house, right? And so that's something we want to know early on.
So as a security practitioner, don't you get tired from just telling people that they need to do the basic stuff? Because you would probably want to go out and do some really cool stuff, some high-end, cutting edge technologies and so on. Are there customers like that you that they've already really advanced in terms of the maturity level, and you get to do some really cool stuff? Maybe?
There are. Those are the ones that it's fun to work with, because then they've made that journey about their security maturity model, and they understand security is an enabler of the business. Now, what can we do to make sure that we are completely protected? I had this conversation, I was in training this week, in fact, and had this conversation with the trainer about, we're going through some complex attack kill chains and methodologies of very complex stuff and how to protect and defend against those. And I brought up the point in the class that, a lot of these are cool. These are things that are interesting to go at. And yeah, they have been seen in the wild. We've seen kind of advance these APT groups and nation states that use them. But for the normal mom and pop, if you just put MFA in, do some of the things like you mentioned, an EDR product, make sure that not everybody is a domain admin. I mean, you got 75 people and 50 of them are domain admins. You want to fix that. If you just take those steps, you lower your risk.
Steve, that sounds like you come across something like that. It's almost sounds like too.
It's real life. It's real life for sure. You have those organizations, and I'm talking about organizations that you would expect to be more security conscious because they're either in the finance space or in the healthcare space. And those to me just seem like you want to have controls and measures in place, regardless if we're talking about cyber or just how you do bank transfers, right? You've got to have process in place. And many of these they're really looking at convenience, and they're looking for the fastest, most efficient way to get things done, rather than the implications of those if there's not security controls in place. So yeah, we've been in business, we've come into environments, this is no lie, come into environments where the total population of the environment might be 300 and they have 75 plus domain admins. I mean, you're more than likely that there's something going to happen in your environment.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And it almost reminds me of the old days where people just plugged in a Wi-Fi and just turned off all the security controls just to make it work.
That's right, just to get everybody on.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because the CIO or the CEO is saying, I got to check my email. You got to get this thing fixed now. So let's just do everything we can to get it fixed. and ultimately that leads to bad things a lot of times.
What about the issues with the supply chain? And that may or may not be of an issue for your customers, but there's always this thing where you're closing the doors. My infrastructure is secure, but then I have all those partners that I now have to worry about. Mm-hmm. Is this a concern for your clients?
Oh yeah, very much so, especially for our clients, because we are a provider for those clients. So, one of our, along with those steps we talk about on onboarding, the other thing is to prove or to validate to those customers the controls that we're using and how we're protecting ourselves so that we're protecting them. But as well as looking at the other vendors they work with. And so as we're involved in customers who have pen tests done or they do some security controls because of their security maturity program or because they're required to, and we look at findings there, we typically will always find issues where there's third-party applications or third-party devices even that are sitting on the network that are just completely vulnerable and exploitable. And those are always discussions that we have to have with customers, and really it comes down once again to risk and what the business function of that application or that device is, whether or not it makes sense to contain it or remove it or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I think the same goes for, again, for cloud environment. It seems like they're like spinning off, application, and a lot of them, like, they have security controls, and then as soon as you come over and you talk to them, they turn it on, and then as soon as you leave,
they turn it off.
they turn it off.
Yeah.
So because I guess it's annoying.
It's a little cumbersome, right? Yeah. Maybe you have to put in a code, a push from an MFA or something. Yeah, for sure. I think cloud is that space too that we're quickly growing into, where third-party risk is becoming tremendous because everybody's plugging in, and in the security space, we want to be as flexible and leverage other tools to give more visibility. We're become better defenders, that sort of thing. But at the same time, as we connect into other tools and there's some insecurity in those spaces, you open yourself up to risk.
Yeah, and I've seen like even the security vendors are not immune. We've seen a lot of security vendors that were.
Oh yeah, I won't mention any names.
Yeah,
but
not
for
names,
sure,
but a lot
sure.
of breach happening, and which is who's going to guard the guards?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of, as I said before, a lot of companies that we protect, you would expect them to have controls in place because they're finance or healthcare. You bring up a good point. A lot of companies that are in the security space / technology space themselves have pretty poor controls around their app dev, their DevSecOps, or whatever it might be. So, we've seen cases where vendors leave, plain text passwords in their code. I mean, so, I think it is a lot of times it's a convenience, or let's, move things as fast as we can. But it's places where for us as a provider or managed service provider, those are always places we have to dig a little and look a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned code review because it's amazing what you're going to find. I talked to somebody at another conference, and they said that they had to do before like a due diligence for, and they found a whole Tetris source code inside.
Yeah.
And they said, who knows how long it's been there. And somebody just decided to be a goofball and put that in there.
Yeah.
So what a true story.
Yeah.
What other technologies excite you here when you see, like, because again, you're learning, right? Which is part of, first of all, it's amazing, right? So what's amazing about this is a lot of practitioners are so bogged down with the day-to-day practice that they're not taking the time off to really establish themselves to see what else is there, because it's such a fast-moving target.
It is.
And as knowledgeable as you are, with so many years of experience, if you were not committed to upgrading your skill set and understanding what's next, it's very easy to lose touch.
Right? It is, especially as you mentioned, as the environment changes and cloud becomes more of a thing for customers and how they incorporate that. You can't continue to provide the value to customers using the same tool sets all the time. So, yeah, I want to upgrade myself personally and professionally. And I think as well, as you mentioned before, just sitting down with some folks and having discussions really gives you an understanding of some of the things they see in the industry, in the marketplace. War stories, those are always really interesting to share and talk through. But then also places where you see deficits or deficiencies in yourself that you can shore up and learn more about.
Is it like the case where you come into a car show and you see all those like unbelievable cars, and then you come back and then you go back into your Toyota Camry and you drive away? Is that the case?
Yeah, there's no doubt. That's a perfect analogy, too, because I've got a Toyota Camry from the driveway. Yeah, you come in and see all the Lamborghinis and the Panteras and all those Ferraris and all those things laid out. But, yeah, there's a lot, right? I mean, you see there's so much really good technology and new items on the market. I mean, talking just as we did a second ago, with the idea of attack simulation and how we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning to do some of those pen testing functions automatically, continuously. Pen tests are fantastic, and they're definitely something we recommend and always follow up with customers on. But if you can look at things that are testing not only your vulnerabilities, but also the other interesting place I see, gets me really excited, is security validation. So it's not just what are you vulnerable to, but even if you've got the controls in place and they protect you against those vulnerabilities, is your defense mechanism working the way it should? Meaning, is it alerting the way it should? Are the right people getting notified? Do they even know when that alert comes in what it means? You know, we're in a lot of incident response. We do a ton of incident response. We've seen a lot of cases where we go into a customer who's got really good tooling, great tooling, maybe deployed pretty effectively, but alerts come into their team or to their provider that they don't know anything about. Right, so we were in an IR recently where a large customer had a really good EDR product. Product was deployed in their environment as large as they were. It's probably 85% deployed, which is a pretty good mark. You want 100%, but 85 really good. And they had an attacker get in the environment on one device that wasn't protected, and the attacker moved laterally in their environment, and their EDR product did exactly what it should. It alerted, send alerts back to their team. But their team was not versed on the product, and so they didn't know what that alert meant. And it led to them being ransomed. The attacker went in and wrote a script to turn the EDR off across the entire environment and ransomed the whole thing, encrypted everything. And they had we saw logs as we came in and looked at the incident response. You all got to alert them on this, but nobody took any steps.
That's an unbelievable story.
Yeah.
And so how do you validate? You mentioned that can be a practice by itself. Because I'm assuming that everyone has the same problem, right? Because it's not just, there's so many moving parts.
Right, there are. And if your tools, I mean, you hear the analogy people say all the time that the attackers, they can get lucky, they don't have to be right every time, but the defender's got to be right every time, right? So, I mean, when you think about that and all those pieces that come into play all the way down the line, I mean, just think about I think that's one of the things that interests me about this whole security validation place is great. We've got a tool that can detect an attack, but who gets notified on that attack? Is your notification system working? I mean, so a lot of companies may be tied into Slack or Teams or other things, or maybe the ticketing system. Is that even working the way you think it is? Because until you go through the exercise, you really don't know, right?
Or alerts too much and then you turn it off.
Exactly.
That happens.
Exactly. And that is what happened in this case, that EDR alerted them and just continued to alert them, and their team was like, it's happening. And this is the other thing too, they get it so often they're like, this must be a false positive because it's happening every day. When the attacker's just sitting back moving wherever they want to, right? So they silence the alert, and then you're vulnerable.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. It reminds me almost like I remember taking a cab from the airport one day, and the driver had a little black tape over the. I guess he had the engine light on.
Oh, yeah.
So he had put a black tape on it, because he didn't want to see it anymore.
He didn't want to see anymore.
Because it was popping out all the time, and nothing happened until the engine blows up.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So out of sight, out of mind until it comes due. Yeah.
So, in your opinion, what would be the best way to start something like that? As you mentioned, to even doing basic validation again, because it doesn't have to be complicated, right?
Yeah, it doesn't.
You can start checking maybe the ABCs of validation.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And that's, I think, not only checks your internal systems, but also if you're using a provider like we are, we want to make sure for our customers, we're validating the things are operating the way you expect them to operate. I think it's the organization running some tests or some exercises in their environment just to make sure the outcome is what they expect. Could be a test malware, there's an ICAR test or something like that. There could be a phishing test they just to make sure that the process is what it is. And it really doesn't have to be complicated. You know the vector. We all know the main vectors that an attacker's coming in, phishing or malware dropping on a machine. Test those and test them, once a month or once a quarter even, at least gives you the idea that, yeah, truly these things are going the way they should. I'm interested, there's a lot of tools that are trying to automate that piece. And I think automation is going to be difficult because every environment's different. But there's some really smart folks out there, way smarter than I am. And so if you can figure that out, then imagine the idea that you tell a customer, okay, what EDR are you using? What ticketing system are you using? You get all these, you understand the inventory, the assets in the environment, and you say, here's this widget, drop it in your environment and let's see what happens. And it tests from beginning, the kill chain, from beginning to end all the way, and the processes around defending that to validate, yeah, we're seeing what we should. We're doing that, we're starting to do that with customers in a very manual way. It's labor intensive, as you can imagine, because different customers have different EDRs, different ticketing systems. But we really are looking at it more to validate ourselves to our customers, right? Because they are entrusting us to do security for them. But that's a whole market, I think, that is on the rise. And when these large organizations who can fund it and actually put those things in place could be really valuable to them.
Yeah. And so what that program will look like potentially, just having somebody come in and run a bunch of scenarios and trying to figure out, what is the workflow, for example, from an alert, like who gets it, what the tool, and then what's who closes the loop on it.
That's right.
Because I'm assuming, listen, I'm sure, I don't know about that case you mentioned, but I'm sure some heads were were because that'll be very aggravating. So you spend the money, you have all the tools, and you did a good job too. 85%, as you mentioned, is pretty good.
Yeah.
And after that, you still, it's almost like it's almost better to not having all of that.
You're right. The cost. Well, I say that the cost they spent on all the controls and the tooling and stuff wouldn't have paid the ransom. It was a pretty hefty ransom that they got hit with. But still, the time and effort that goes behind deploying that and getting all that control in place is considerable, without a doubt. So yeah, I was privy to those conversations that happened around the C-suite. That there were a lot of expletives, as you can imagine, about these controls that we put in. Hey, we paid for this, we put it in, and I think that's, to your point, that's a frustrating part of it.
Yeah,
if you do get an organization that is making good decisions and wants to raise their security maturity level, but then things fall down like that, where there's good training for their analysts or their security teams, the notification channel or alerting channel working the way it should. As I said, there's all these places where things could fall down. You really need to test it and make sure that it's flowing correctly.
You should figure it out what that program looks like, and then that's going to be our talk for in Black Hat next year.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm serious. I think it makes total sense, and I think a lot of companies are now, and I think that's the missing link. I think because companies do spend the money, the majority do spend the money and the effort and all that stuff, and then I think that there's some breaking points and it doesn't have to be complicated.
It really doesn't. As I said, the majority of the vectors. Now, you may not be able to test every scenario out there, but once again, as I told our instructor, these attackers that are doing ransomware as a service aren't doing all these advanced, crazy techniques. They're doing 5 or 6 techniques that it's fairly easy for you to protect yourself against. Just do those things, and your risk level goes down tremendously, right? Yeah. And the same thing, when you do those things, then validate that they work. We've been in environments as well where they had multi-factor deployed and just really good job of thought everything covered multi-factor, but they had 3 or 4 accounts of guys who had older phones or gals who had older phones or maybe just didn't want the push. A CFO said, I'm not going to do that push, not put on the phone. And those are the accounts that the attackers go after and they breach. And so you still need to know, where you're in the security space. Corner cases can have impact, so you need to know your corner cases.
Yeah, and you don't want to be in that corner as well. When
you don't.
Where you're the one who's, because I'm sure these people have some questions to ask, especially again after they spend the money. That's amazing. So, I'll probably first of all, thank you very much for coming and spending time. Much appreciated.
Been great.
And I'll probably meet you up at one of the after hours event. And you should invite me over to North Carolina. I can't see that. I would love to get into the vault.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Likewise, I want to come to New York.
Yeah, we should do that.
I would love to come to one of your events.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you do tours for customers that
we do?
develop?
We do. Yeah.
It's funny because there's a lot of bank vaults because now it's all digital, so a lot of these bank branches got closed down or converted. I remember seeing one that was a clothing store, right? Retail. Yeah. But I think being a security center is much better. So do you ever close it down, like to shut down the doors, or is this still like?
So the doors, they're operational, but the locks on them have been disabled. So you can, while you can close the door, you can't lock the doors, and it's pretty different. These are, they're massive doors to close. There's 2 of them on each end of the vault. But yeah, I'd love to have you come check it out. We should do a podcast
from inside
the vault. Yeah, it's something else.
Maybe that's a cool podcast series. From inside the vault. We should do that.
Maybe even some of the younger population who just takes security for granted. Right. I'll give you a case, an instance here. I've got my son. As he was younger, played a lot of games online and things like that. Had some friends who played online and their online account. There's a business. A lot of these hackers or whatever have a business where they steal in-game money from Fortnite or Roblox.
It happened to my son for sure.
Yeah, and so some of these kids set their passwords at password or something like that because they really don't understand the gravity of what they're. I mean, to that kid's parent. Because I spoke to him, that was money. That's real money he lost, right? He put $50 in the kid's account, and somebody went in and cleaned him out. And the kid's crying because he doesn't have his Fortnite coat or whatever, but Dad's crying because $50. But
I was like, it's good that you got burnt now instead of having your bank account clean when you're like older.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes those unfortunate events are teaching,
and they're getting so good. Like I swear, these text messages are. They're professionals. They look good.
They do.
The email looks great. Every once in a while, I just get it, and I always think before I look at it, and I look at it, and they're very convincing.
Right, and I think that's one of the sad untold stories. One of the things that me personally, I really want to try to overcome or look into trying to help a lot of those people that are in situations where they're being taken advantage of just because they don't understand the technology. I think about the older folks, my parents, and folks that are in that age where when they get a text from the bank that really looks legitimate, hey, somebody just did something on your account. Yeah. They're going to click it because they want to know.
Click it or call. They call the number, right?
Yeah.
I remember just, I called this supposedly Amazon transaction thing, and I knew the person behind, I knew that it's a fake because Amazon never sends those texts anyway. But, they're just very convincing. They walk you through, and I heard a story of somebody that got their account taken over, and they emailed the CFO to wire some money, and it was a very large sum of money, and the CFO did the right thing and called.
Yeah.
And the person on the other line said, it's transfer.
Right.
Because they changed the number.
Yeah.
Whoever answered on the other side was not the person.
Not the person they thought they were.
Yeah. And they transferred the funds, and so be it.
And in the business and the technology world, there's still a lot of awareness, and I think those kind of processes and things still need to be learned. You hear, well, you don't really hear. I always tell people for every one ransomware story that the media publishes, there's thousands that happen behind the scenes, but you really don't hear a lot of the personal situations where people get scammed out of maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars, but still a real impact to them. And an attacker in these days, if I can, I might go after the big corporation where I get $1 million payout, or maybe I go after the 100,000 individuals that I can get $1,000 payout. I can make the same amount of money either way, and it might be a whole lot easier, Yeah. So that's a place where I see, as a country, we still struggle with that culture of security and just, trusting things a little too much.
Yeah, and I think this has to start at an early age.
Yeah.
Like your son, you mentioned, I got a taste of it early on, but I don't think that happens enough. I think we're, and they're all given devices that are capable of doing everything, and everything's becoming online. And you're getting hacked, and as you mentioned, and even to start with small things, like somebody posts a container. Do you know there's a whole container scam going on, like where people put, I don't know why you're you want to purchase a container, but people are trying to purchase containers, and then there's like you put money up front and you never see because the person in Nigeria,
right?
Simple as that. And then Craigslist or Facebook or whatever, they never take those down.
Mm-hmm.
So they take ownership of accounts that were compromised.
Yeah.
So it looks like a legit person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then and then you wire them like $2,000 and it's gone. And it's not. I mean, some people have $2,000 a lot of money.
Right. Exactly.
Especially to lose like that.
For sure.
So yeah, we have to do something about that as well. But again, we deal with enterprise, but eventually. It's a matter of everyone's,
I agree.
national security to do that.
I agree completely.
And I think that every time, I've seen that with the pandemic and now with the economic conditions being the way they are, I always see it as an uptick. It's almost like maybe because people are stressed out and then more vulnerable, and then as you mentioned, they're revenue centers.
Yep,
right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and when anytime the attackers are for everything else, they're trying to make they're looking at the ROI, trying to make as much money as they can, and when they're in those. When people are already under stress and anxiety because of pandemic or economy or whatever it is, they're easier targets. There's no doubt about it. And so the attackers are just going to kind of pile on in those places.
Yeah, for sure. Well, at least you mentioned your son is here in Black Hat, right? And did you tell him? Oh, I guess DEF CON, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that he's got to leave the phone in the room.
Yeah, that's right. You can't be on that. I did tell him that too. You don't connect to any Wi-Fi, do any of that kind of stuff. Let's be safe for sure. Yeah.
Tell him what's a wall of wall of shame or pawn wall.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you don't
the pawn wall. Yeah. You don't want his picture on that for sure.
And then what's interesting, I think there's a place specifically to do security for gamers.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know why there's not either education or even the ability for you to, potentially secure account.
Right.
Because you mentioned it at $50, but some people have thousands, tens of thousands of digital assets.
Mm-hmm. They do.
So. But until then, Steve, thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the after hours.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Dave.
Thank you.